Hello, I'm Stephen Steer. What you see in front of you is a paper I wrote for the UK's Energy Digitalisation Task Force. This paper is all about how to govern the digital transformation of the UK's energy system and the wider energy sector that sits around that system. Today, what I'm going to do is not talk to you about the paper directly, but talk to you about directly about the solution at one level of detail beyond the paper that I recommended when I wrote this. Now, if you're not familiar with this paper, I'm just going to warn you now that in this video, I'm going to skip through a lot of context, a lot of rationales and reasons for the recommendation, the solution that I've put together. I'm going to get straight into the detail of talking about that solution. So if you find that you're unclear on the why behind a lot of this information, I'll make the paper available next to the video. I'll also point to another video I've written which gave a lot of that rationale. Not video written, a video I presented that gave a lot of that rationale. So let's not talk about the paper directly today, except just to point out one of the diagrams from that paper, which is this here. Again, I'm not going to give you all the context other than just to give you the links between the paper and this video. So we'll come back to these at the end, but just to mention it now, we have a marketplace. This white box represents the entire energy sector, both the parts that you might call a free market and the parts that you might think of as a centrally planned or constrained, regulated, intervened, nationally planned market, whatever way you want to think about it. Top right here is what was called a sectoral knowledge base, something in the public domain, a set of information that describes the digital architecture, digital solutions that we're going to be talking about. And then there's three different governing bodies that were mentioned in the paper. The first one on the left called a delivery body, second in the middle, stakeholders panel, and lastly, a series of delivery orchestrators. And what you're going to find as I talk about this video is the language has evolved since this was written, but I'm going to give you the links and tie together what we talk about to this diagram so it all slots together. So here we are with what I'd like to talk through on this video. Left-hand side is just a little bit of scene setting, the context. I won't do much on it. And on the right-hand side is that one tier more detailed version of the solution I'd written about in the paper that hopefully brings it to life a little bit, because the paper admittedly is at risk of making sure the theory is clear without providing that slice through what the theory means. So I'm not going to spend long on this and say the context is in the paper, but essentially what my proposal is for how to govern the digitalisation the energy sector is to take well-established enterprise architecture methods and to take the delivery methods embodied by what's usually called agile working and to join them together and apply them at a sectoral level. Now, the important thing here is my hypothesis is that because of the features about the way energy services operate and the fact that they're very infrastructure intensive, where markets can be limited, that for large parts, i.e. the public bodies and the licensed bodies, licensed private bodies that operate in the energy sector, they can all really be treated as a single organisation that each delivering part of a single service rather than separate services to one another. If you take that hypothesis of treating them as a single organisation, then it makes sense that for that single organisation, you can establish its single enterprise architecture function, and you can establish agile working practices that ensure and assure the work of the sector follows best practice methods. So that's what we're going to, that's what's going to be implied as we talk through this diagram over here. So this is me describing those four different features I talked about at the start from the paper, which are just acknowledged in this bottom corner down here: the digital delivery body, orchestrators, stakeholders panel, and a knowledge base. They're all in here, and I'll place these on the diagram later so it's fairly obvious where they go, but it's nice to see it all together. So I've tried to make it simple, but it's always hard to make a diagram easy to read and for people to understand what you're getting at. So we'll do a talk through it. But the important large features to note is there's this big sort of orangey red area here. This is what I've called now the digitalisation orchestrator. It could be whatever you want. It's an unfortunate messing around with words, and I'm actually just going to right now move what was the turquoise box from the paper and just acknowledge that the entire orange area is that overarching body, right? That's where it fits together. So before we talk about the detail within that, let's look at the other pieces around it. We've got DESNZ, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, on the left. And we've got Ofgem, the energy regulator, above. And then in green here on the right-hand side, we've got the energy sector. But notice that DESNZ and Ofgem do feature again. They are part of the sector, as well as being the governing bodies that sit around it. So with those acknowledgements done, let's start stepping through some of the details. So the role of DESNZ tries to be fairly limited. Their job is to provide oversight and legitimacy to organisations like the orchestrator, and as well as they do that for the organisations like Ofgem, the regulator. That should be the first and last time we need to talk about DESNZ, because as long as all's working well, they don't need to intervene and do more. So assuming they've established the orchestrator, what does it do? Well, within it, you'll see there's a couple of colours within the orange red box here, yellow and blue. Yellow I would describe as the kind of human capabilities in place, where the blue boxes are some of the key features about the organisation. So let's walk through each of these. There's a real nexus point here in what I've called strategic planning. Strategic planning is the idea that members of the energy sector will be setting a direction about what digital services are wanted in across the sector. There's a few different people involved in getting to a good decision for that. And so what I've got here is the stakeholders panel, the program office, and the architecture office, and they each fulfill different roles. So the stakeholders panel is meant to represent the interests ultimately of energy consumers, but actually there'll be quite a number of different people who have a strong stake in the design of the digital energy sector. And so you might expect to see representatives from across the energy sector on that panel. It seems logical to me that the constituents in that panel are not actually governed by the Digitalisation Orchestrator itself, but by Ofgem as the regulator. And as the regulator, they want to ensure that there's appropriate representation for the sector on that panel. I can imagine extreme cases in either end, actually. You might say that the entire panel is made up of Ofgem staff. Ofgem might want that, the sector might tolerate that. You could also say that actual lay people, energy consumers who don't have special knowledge of the sector but do know what they want from their energy service should be on that panel. You may wish to put people who are considered to be experts in their field on different topics and subject matters within the panel. It may be that you need to have complicated panels where you have different representation for different topics. There's a lot of choices there, and I don't think there's any need to prejudge what the best set of choices is right now. And you can work that out as you go. So that's a panel of people who are there with their purpose being to say what they want. These are our priorities. This is what we need. But just saying what you want isn't enough if you're going to design and engineer sectors, digital services, because sometimes what you want isn't realistic. People want conflicting things and they can't have everything. So let's start down at the architecture office. The architecture office really is, and let me just zoom out for a moment, representing this enterprise architecture section here in the top left. These are the people who are used to designing digital services, and in particular, this office is probably populated with people who are used to designing really large-scale macro, manage the entire organization. Remember, in this case, that's the whole energy sector. So they're the people who are able to have a handle on an entire sector's worth of investments into digital services. And their job, not in detail, but to some extent, will be to design what kinds of services could exist based on what is understood to be wanted by the sector. But it's not the architect's job to say, this is what you're going to have. They're not the right people to have the power to decide on the actual design of the sector, but they are the right people to present the realistic options that are available, that could practically be built, that as best as possible meet the probably competing set of requirements that the sector has. Here are the three things that you could have. None of them give you all of your needs, stakeholders panel, please tell me which approach you want most, and we'll go and do that. That's the purpose. Now, importantly, these two groups of people who are specialists in understanding the sector and what it needs and wants and what they want from their services in the stakeholders panel, and the architecture office, people who are specialists in designing digital services, what they're not best at is ensuring that the way decision making takes place is optimized, to make sure that there's a really strong basis of evidence behind each decision, to make sure that there's a sufficient degree of specificity behind each decision and a clear evidence base that's well documented. That means that when people go on and deliver the work, they understand the basis of the decision, they understand the scope, they know when to come back and ask for more information, and so on. This is where the program office comes in, who is an organizer, a kind of team within the digitalisation orchestrator who specialise in facilitating, of making sure how things are conducted is done in a really effective way. Now, I've quietly overlooked a necessary detail to be able to carry out strategic planning, because I talked about the architecture office designing based on the requirements of the sector. And the stakeholders panel, similarly, as expert as they may be or informed as they might be, they still need to appreciate the whole sector's opinions and needs and preferences. So that takes us over to the right-hand side here. It's the orange box where we have the research office. The research office, and for those of you familiar with Agile working, we can think of this as sort of discovery research, ongoing user research, and so forth. It's learning about people's requirements, and that's it, right? The trick here is that the research office is converting people's desires and expressed needs and concerns into functional and non-functional requirements that are implied by those set of needs. And again, I use those words functional and non-functional requirements carefully, because they are defined terms when dealing with digital service development. So the research officer's job is to do a lot of strong engagement with the wider sector, learn about all kinds of topics, and I've given just a few examples here. Excuse me, clicked incorrectly, of the kinds of things that they might be interested in, that we might need to learn about, and their job is to make that information available so that the strategic planning can take place effectively. Now then, before I go all the way through this diagram, what I thought might be a useful thing for those who are familiar with Agile working, and even for those of you who aren't, it might help a little, is to start explaining what these different features on the overall governance design would be if this really were just a small single team of individuals, even though in practice it's not quite true, but it helps the brain, I think, imagine. So we've got some little purple notes here on the left-hand side. Top one is customers. Customers are people who are part of the sector. Customers receive the services from people who run energy companies. There's many different types of people in the sector, though. Interested stakeholders, people who've got some interest at stake in how digital services are being developed, wider context that sits around the energy sector and such. And in addition to that, there'll be a whole lot of people in the energy sector who are directly energy experts, subject matter experts, SMEs. There'll be lots of them, and that's a really broad bucket, but it essentially captures all the types of people who are either operating in a sector or receiving services from the sector, or providing policy around the sector, all kinds of things. So they're the kinds of people who you'll be doing research with. They're as a research office, they're the kinds of people who some among them might be selected to be members of the stakeholder panel. But now let's get into, and this is where the Agile working bit kicks in, and it's just a little reminder, the Agile software development cycle. There's a lot of job types that are commonplace among Agile development, and I thought it'd be quite helpful to place them across the diagram. So as with any program, you might have some kind of senior responsible owner, someone who is ultimately accountable for the work, but probably is letting other people do the work. I talked about them earlier. In this case, it's probably DESNZ as the government department that has ultimate accountability for a functioning UK energy sector. I talked about having a programme office who facilitate the ways of working between the stakeholders panel and the architecture office. They're essentially delivery managers. If you're an Agile working team, you might know what it means to be a delivery manager. If you're not, then at least you've got a way of understanding what I mean when I talk about having a programme office. It's people who can facilitate delivery management. And go look up the job title, Google it, basically, if you want to know more. There are such people who have career paths known as being an enterprise architect. And at this level, that's really what the architecture office is there to do, is to design the enterprise architecture. I've then got business analysis. Well, business analysis sits over here with the research office. These are the people, and I should be more appropriate, actually, what we should probably include. So another good group of agile language, which is user research. But these are the people who are doing a combination of interviewing, speaking to people, reviewing documentation and so forth, and digesting all that information and making it easy for other people to work with, but doing it in a very rigorous way that would be required for software development. We won't get into any more detail on that now. Then we've got left that we've talked about so far is the stakeholders panel. Again, those who are familiar with agile working will understand the role, a very important role in the agile development cycle, which is the product owner. These are the people who ultimately get to decide what is it that we are building. Everyone else has opinions on how you might go about doing things, but it's the product owner who is the directive leader who says, this is what we want. This will best meet energy consumers' needs. Go and build that. They may not know how to build it. They're not technical experts necessarily, but they have been presented with a lot of, let's call it, business information and technical risks and understanding about complexity that it would take to deliver their preference. Do you want the simple option but doesn't meet all your needs, or do you want the complicated option that eventually will meet all your needs but comes with some risks, caveats, and so forth? So this will be subject matter that might be about what level of reliability do you want from service X or Y, or where do you want competitive markets versus centrally planned single services, that kind of thing. So what we've got now is the top level kind of designed, and that's why I put this sort of dotted line down the middle here, right? This is your top level stuff of overarchingly, what does the sector look like? There's only one part of it I haven't talked about yet, which is this shared knowledge base in the middle. And the premise here is that, as I've mentioned already, there's quite a bit of research to be done. There's also a lot of decision making to be done. There's a lot of information about what ways of working should look like. And there's a lot of information arising of the actual blueprints, the architectural designs, and fundamentally the overall blueprint of the UK energy system. All of that needs to be documented somewhere, and ideally it needs to be as available as possible. And so there's some kind of shared knowledge base where all the information is getting documented, and that itself, probably through the research office, needs to be curated. There are obviously some information which might be sensitive that you can't share into the full public domain, but that's fine. The energy sector has already overcome this challenge through a piece of work called Data Best Practice Guidance from Ofgem, the regulator, which I happen to be the author of, which guides people through how to make information available responsibly. And so this is, so there you go, that's the top part of the picture. We now need to step down a level of detail on the design of digital services across the energy sector. So here's the implementation section, or at least the beginnings of it. Once you've got some kind of agreed architecture, which has been based on the panel's preferences and decisions the architects have put together, you now need to get into delivery. You can't quite do that yet because enterprise architecture tends to be a bit up in the clouds. You don't have a very specific design to the blueprint. It's large boxes, not detailed reams of information that allow you to actually design and build your whatever digital widget you're doing now. And so what the architecture function will need to do, and probably with the support of the program office, is oversee a series of individual, what I think should be best called design authorities. Your overall design authority is up here, the enterprise architecture function. But on any given particular topic, which would be grouped and organized as per the architecture office's preferences, you now need to start fanning out the work. It's not feasible for the architecture office itself to go and do all of the work itself. There's too much. It's an entire sector's worth of digital services that need to be built. But their role is to make sure that that every time they stand up a design authority to solve a specific topic, that what they're doing is governing and coordinating how all those different parts fit together, which is something that's absent from the energy sector today. And importantly, they're also there to assure the work, to make sure each of those design authorities is delivering to a common approach, standards, and in particular, you'll notice this diagram flows on. I haven't talked about it yet, but the design authorities will output solution architecture that needs to flow into the shared knowledge base. And so the architecture function needs to make sure that the designs that are being drummed up are effective and good and high quality and consistent. Meanwhile, the program office will be ensuring that the way the design authority will make decisions is a good one. At least they will be at a high level. Please excuse Norbert, he's very excited. His birthday today, he is 3 years old. I don't know what Teams is doing to suppress the sound, but it's very loud to me. Okay, right. The design authorities are stepping down a level of detail from your overall enterprise architecture to giving you some fairly well scoped designs. But the important thing is that they are just designs, they haven't built anything. And additionally, the people who populate these design authorities, they're probably largely members from the sector, maybe from other sectors as well. That'd probably be quite healthy. But they're not all staff working at the digitalisation orchestrator. It's just that the orchestrator is governing and making sure those authorities work effectively. So what you'll get is a whole series of solution architectures, and I've already mentioned that they need to be fed into the overall blueprint that's being built that represents the digital energy system. So the next step is to think about how the work actually then gets done. And that could take a variety of ways. But the work that actually needs to get done is even more detailed design, the real micro detail of exactly how each algorithm will work and what data is required and what softwares will be selected. And then that work needs to actually be built and it needs to be run and operated. And that could be done in many different ways, whether it's by passing the work on to existing licensed entities into the sector, whether it's a competitive tender to have the privilege to build the piece of work, whether it's public bodies that are best appointed to get on with a particular task. It can be a whole myriad of things, and you might find that the stakeholders panel has set some requirements around those responsibilities, as well as around its preferences for which architecture solution to have. You may find that sometimes there's new types of licensing that needs to be established, and that might be something that goes straight back to Ofgem, where it's quite a structural decision for the sector. You could imagine Ofgem would have quite a strong opinion about the division of those roles and responsibilities. So what I've done there with the rest of the diagram is I've talked about the idea of having some kind of project or tech lead that's solving a specific challenge within the overall single enterprise, governed by the enterprise architect. What we'll also find is that there's some kind of quality assurance taking place. The QAs will actually feature in multiple locations. So the architecture office might QA how detailed designs take place. The design authorities might govern how the detailed design is taking place to some extent. And you may find that the actual build work is also having tests and quality assurance applied to it. So there's a lot of QAing of different types. And in fact, it'd probably go further than just the 3 places I've mentioned. There's one last sticky that I haven't placed on my diagram yet, which is this one called developers. And as I said, the build and run is taking place by the sector. And so the development work, if it takes place here. So if you look at this diagram and just focus on the purple stickies, what I've done is somewhat describe what usually gets called a cross-functional agile working team. And as I said at the start, that's one of the 2 premises as how I've gone about designing the solution. Within that, there's also the macro function of managing the enterprise architecture of a single organization that is the sector. Now, just to round things out and tie things back to the paper, I said in the paper there should be some kind of stakeholders panel. That's quite clearly still there, name not changed. Diagram representing the product ownership of the sector. Next up, we have the sectoral knowledge base, again, relatively unchanged. Really not precious about the naming conventions here, but there's some kind of knowledge base that's being managed. And then lastly, I talked previously about having delivery orchestrators, many individual orchestrators, and that's represented here by 3 different design authorities. Honestly, in reality, it could be quite a large number of them. So that's the design. I think introducing a digitalization orchestrator into the sector that is independent of any other body. And that's really important. That part of the premise and the rationale here is the orchestrator has no other stake in the energy sector. And actually, even more so, it has very little stake in what kind of energy sector we have. The main function of the orchestrator is to make sure the panel has made decisions. The architects, whilst they'd have a lot of opinions about architecture, don't necessarily care about energy services. And whilst you may begin to have some opinions and preferences about energy services down in a design authority, well, at that point, a lot of the people who populate those authorities are people from the sector. It's the sector doing that work. They're just doing it in ways of working that have been set up centrally to ensure the designs are reusable, are interoperable, are low-risk investments for the organisations that have to go on and do the build work. But essentially what you have here is a cross-functional agile team and an enterprise architecture function abstracted to a sectoral level. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in the world, and I certainly have it, in abstracting beyond just the energy sector and how do we coordinate across infrastructure sectors and so forth. There's very little in this design that is bespoke and targeted to the UK energy sector. It'd be very easy to tweak at the edges, change who has overall accountability, possibly add in an extra layer of hierarchy if you really start going across the whole economy or even internationally. But the general approach remains unchanged in my view. So that's it. That is some more detailed view of what I'd recommended previously. I tried to keep it very lean and simple. This is the introduction of a single additional entity, importantly, who is empowered to have a strong ability to set the sector-wide digital services, not to actually do it itself. And there's a lot of important economics thinking in the background, which is in the paper, not talked about today, about ensuring markets can operate as much as possible while centralizing as little as possible, and just a thin slice of centralizing the architecture function and the decision-making process for the sector. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.